आजको सेमिनार चाहिँ इट्स अ बुक टक। युजुअली बुक टक भनेको चाहिँ यो किताब निस्किसकेपछि त्यो किताबमा आधारित सेमिनार अथवा प्रेजेन्टेसनलाई बुक टक भन्ने गरिन्छ। आजको प्रेजेन्टेसन चाहिँ त्यो क्याटेगोरीको पऱ्यो। वार थ्रु एन इन्टरसेक्सनल लेन्स, फिमेल कम्बाटेन्ट्स एन्ड द माओइस्ट इन्सर्जेन्सी इन नेपाल भन्ने किताब 2025 मा लास्ट इयर अक्सफोर्ड युनिभर्सिटी प्रेसले निकाल्यो। यो चाहिँ यसको अथर चाहिँ केशब गिरी हुनुहुन्छ, उहाँको परिचय एकछिनमा गरौँला। यो किताब चाहिँ म अहिले सर्कुलेट पनि गर्छु र अन्तमा मौका फिर्ता आओस्, दिस विल इभेन्चुअली एन्ड अप इन द माटी जोतारी लाइब्रेरी, रिभ्यू हुने सिनास जर्नलमा रिभ्यू हुने पनि सम्भावना छ होइन। यति भनिसकेपछि किताबमा आधारित प्रेजेन्टेसन केशवजीले अहिले एकछिनमा गर्नुहुन्छ, 45 मिनट जति। केशवजीको छोटो परिचय चाहिँ he finished his PhD in international relations from the University of Sydney in 2020. And he is now a lecturer in international relations at the University of St Andrews, North Scotland. कहिले गएको तपाईँ? 2023 मा त्यहाँ जानुभयो। You were also at the Harvard Kennedy School as a fellow there, physically उतै हार्वर्डमा लोकेट गरे during 23-24. His research interests expand basically women combatants, intersectionality, gender and war, violent extremism, leftist insurgencies, feminist international relations, feminist research methodology, rebel governance, and governance and intimacy in rebel groups. He's published articles in various journals, and this is his first book. So it's all yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, it's indeed an honor to present my work here, and some of the scholars whose scholarship inspired my work are here. Sarah Tamangi, I have cited you profusely in my book, and you also inspired some of my intellectual thinking. And thank you for kind and warm introduction. So, Poilata, thank you for showing up for this event. You could have been to many places. You might have many priorities and joys.
Or watch the cricket game.
Yeah, catching up with your work, watching cricket game. But thank you for giving your time to me. Since March 5 has filled the air in Nepal, I was thinking, like, how do I make this book relevant? So, in run-up to this election, every 10 and 15 years, it seems to me that we witness a new political movement, or sometimes an armed conflict, and that produces a fresh batch of martyrs. Soon after, however, the scene of initial hope and excitement wears off. Dream is perpetually deferred. With that, the audacity of hope diminishes. So we had this sort of dreaming of building Nepal as Switzerland and Singapore. Then we shifted to building roads and bridges, and then getting our cities pollution-free, waste management. Now we have woken up to a new reality. We want political leaders who are relatively unblemished and who are not engaged in any sort of corruption or any sort of mismanagement. But then I keep thinking of these stories of martyrs, and also their dreams and hopes, which have been the casualties of corruption, mismanagement, greed of our political leaders. And also, to some extent, it is also a way, a scholarly duty for me to hold ourselves, the collective us, accountable for our conformity and complicity in letting their dreams and hopes dashing away. So, novelty of stories I present in my book is that this martyr is gendered, caste, classed, ethnicized, and location bound. I look at all those different social categories of power and how do they intersect and how do they shape their life. To me, without considering their intersectional subjectivity and positionality, we risk misrepresenting their stories, misunderstanding what they really fought and sacrificed their precious lives for. So with this prologue, I would like to begin the talk. I will start with the questions that animated my book, the 2 questions, and I will start with the 4 broader conclusion that I draw from my book. And then I will proceed on to presenting my chapter 6, which is about politicization of private sphere. So I will talk broadly about how rebel organizations, they politicize private sphere, not just to articulate their political agendas, but also to consolidate and then sustain their movement. So the 2 questions that I ask in this book are, how do female combatants experience pre-war, war, and post-war peace, especially when they constitute a diverse group? And what insights can be gained about war and its aftermath through an exploration of experiences of female combatants in their private lives? As the title suggests, I use feminist intersectional lens to explore these 2 questions. Then I have 4 broad conclusions. The first, female ex-combatants' experiences of war are complex and varied, and such complexity can be legible when looked through feminist intersectional lens. Second, overarching conclusion from my research understands that a standard pre, during, and post-war temporal compartmentalization. I'll come back to that later. This is a bit wordy. That does not correspond to the lived experiences of female ex-combatants in the Maoist insurgency in Nepal. The third finding from my book confirms feminist scholarship that suggests that inseparability of private and public and personal and political, the binary between everyday violence, the violence in private realm, and the exceptional and spectacular violence, including sexual violence in events of war, only contributes to our flawed and gender-biased understanding of war. Most importantly, invisibilization of virulent politics in the private sphere serves to widen existing power hierarchy and inequality. Finally, in order to make sense of the complexity, I talk about continuum of violence, I talk about messiness of war. My proposition is that, my conclusion is that we need to look at social group. In this case, female ex-combatants, or women combatants, who are at the bottom of social hierarchy, who are at the intersection of multiple forms of oppressions, be it class, caste, ethnicity, geographical location, and so on. And that's where we find the constellation of different violence taking place. In terms of the structure of my book, it is organized into 7 chapters, including introduction and conclusion chapter. The introductory chapter introduces the key theoretical argument, and the contribution that it makes, and also it lays out the theoretical framework and methodological approach that I take in the book. Chapter 2 carves out the significance of theoretical proposition for this book in the broader theoretical debate surrounding agency and victimhood of women combatants. While this chapter builds on agency debate regarding the participation of women in war between liberal and radical critical feminists, this chapter aligns with demands from some feminist scholars to foreground the actions and embodied experiences of women combatants beyond the narrow confines of victimhood and agency. I draw from feminist scholars in different disciplinary backgrounds, Silla Roy, Carlota Silver, Jessica After, and in the context of Nepal, Lauren Lee, Andrea Nightingale, and also Sarah Tamang, who is here. So this chapter politicizes the agency tied to violent political events to propose a theorization of women's everyday embodied experience of war, both in public and in private realm. Similarly, I use matrices of domination, intersectional theoretical framework proposed by Patricia Hill Collins, Black feminist intersectional scholar. I use that lens to understand how everyday embodied experiences of war are set and constituted by intersecting identities and social subjectivities of diverse groups of female combatants. It also weaves together feminist concept of messiness of war and continuum of violence, hidden in the politics of silence and hypervisibility. In chapter 3, I discuss the production of knowledge based on everyday embodied experience of female combatants as a negotiated political process. Feminist research highlights that knowledge production is intensely political. As this book focuses on complex and diverse experiences of female combatants as conditioned by their simultaneously intersecting systems of operations and identities, it is imperative to discuss how my own multiple complex identities and social locations they interact with my research projects and how that has bearing on the research process and research outcome. Again, intersectionality as a theoretical framework and methodological approach also requires confronting researchers' own positionality, and then how that, like I said, manifests in the research process. In chapter 4, I critically engaged with Maoist hegemonic narratives on women as mobilization strategy that homogenize pre-war experiences of women in Nepal. Again, here I draw a lot from Sarah Tamangji. The chapter offers a context-specific analysis of women's recruitment in the Maoist insurgency in Nepal that add novel insights to existing theories on why women rebel. It explores some of the unique mobilization strategies devised by Maoists in Nepal, such as claim of progressive perspective on women question, chiseled by strategic learning, instrumentalization of patriarchy, symbiosis between ideology and identity, and simplistic representations of women's issues and experiences. Yet these strategies fail to take into account the diversity of women's experiences, constituting silencing of women at the margin and producing singular, essentialized narratives. In this context, a matrices of domination, intersectional theoretical framework is useful in recovering those silenced voices, exploring alternative contexts, problematizing, universalizing narratives, and presenting the complex experiences of women combatants at the margin. Chapter 5 and 6 explore the experiences of women combatants, both in the public and private spheres, conditioned by their simultaneously intersecting identities and social subjectivities. Chapter 5 seeks to problematize the assumption of literature on female combatants that often portray female combatants as homogeneous group, having identical experiences of war and its aftermath. It uses intersectional framework inspired by matrices of domination to explore the stories of female ex-combatants in the Maoist insurgency in Nepal, coming from different social backgrounds, caste, class, social status, geographical location. It particularly focuses on the stories of 5 female ex-combatants. I have used pseudonyms here: Binu, Vita, Sarita, Dipana, and Santi. The chapter illustrates the myriad ways various matrices of domination intricately interact, collide, and combine to condition the lives of women ex-combatants. Of course, different temporal, when I say temporal, pre-war, during war, and after-war experiences, and also its spatial context. I look at how they experience war and post-war in terms of in kitchen, in municipality office, in grocery store. Only prioritizing the voices of female ex-combatants at the intersection of multiple operations and fostering alternative ways of knowing the war can challenge the hegemonic, universal, and singular narratives and discourses of war. Chapter 6, which I will discuss in detail today, applies the intersectional theoretical framework to the private sphere, exploring how the Maoist insurgency in Nepal politicized and militarized the lives of female combatants, resulting in diverse impacts on different bodies. And the concluding chapter summarizes and binds together all these different strands of arguments, reflecting on their research and policy implications. Okay, then this presentation will be based on chapter 6, where I talk about politicization of private sphere. So this is the overview. I gave you the overview of the book, and this is the overview of the chapter. I will start with rebel governance, what rebel governance is, a basic rudimentary understanding of rebel governance, and then how different rebel organizations, they seek to govern marriage and sexuality. And then I'll come back to the Maoist insurgency in Nepal, why I looked at this insurgency. I will also look at the puzzle why rebel groups, they intend to govern this private sphere, which is a very difficult thing to do. And then I will present my finding. Okay, for the sake of simplicity, the rebel governance, the definition that I have come up with is simple, but I guess that's what I need for this talk. As I mentioned earlier, I'm predominantly international relations scholar. IR as a discipline is state-centric, meaning that it doesn't have enough and appropriate theoretical frameworks to understand the territories that are not governed by a state. The territories that are beyond the reach of the state or that are ungoverned by a state are portrayed as black spots, unknowable areas, ungoverned territories, territories lacking authority and order, or they fall into cracks of territorial trap. This essentially means that we have entire globe divided into sovereign territories known as states, and the other ones, we don't even have a name for them. Even though we have many parts of different countries beyond the control of the state, they are still characterized as part of that state. For example, Myanmar, right? Recently Somaliland got recognition from few states, including Israel. So coming to non-state actors in international relations, non-state actors are often named as bandits when they try to govern, as mafias, warlords as remnants of feudalism, and terrorists, nihilists who want to destroy existing institutions and structures. By extension of this cumulative mainstream IR wisdom, and linking back to my chapter today, rebel-held territories are sites of anarchy and lawlessness that permit debauchery, licentious behavior, and they are hotbed of immorality. I will clarify a little bit on what type of insurgents that I'm looking for. There are different types of rebel groups. Some of them are roving insurgents. They don't have fixed and stable territorial ground. A paradigmatic case of this is Lord's Resistance Army in northern Uganda. Then we have insurgents that seek to displace the population that they do not necessarily agree with. For example, Rwandan Patriotic Front, who displaced Hutu population from the areas that they sought to govern. These are not the interest of my research. I'm looking at the insurgents who have control over territory and they want to govern. They establish certain sort of governance structures, taxation, public good provision, and then And in some cases, they also seek to govern private spheres, such as marriage and sexuality. And these are the rebel groups that I'm looking at. So then, what is rebel governance? Anna Arjona, Nelson Casper, and Zachariah Mampeli, they put it simply: when rebel groups, they control a territory, they need to decide how they're going to interact with the constituency, people living in that territory. According to Anna Arjona, rebel governance refers to a creation of social order, she calls rebelocracy, that constitutes a social contract between rebel groups and the people living under their rule. So it is a set of rules that structure human interaction in a given community during wartime, allowing for predictability to exist. Again, there are different level, intensity, and scope of rebel governance. We have some rebel groups who have constitutions, who have flag, who have national anthems, such as War State Army in Myanmar, Nagaland Socialist Council of Nagaland, National Socialist Council of Nagaland. They have their own foreign ministry, but there are other groups that are not that much developed in terms of devising their own governance system. But there has to be three conditions present for rebel governance. First, they need to control a territory. They need to have resident population in that territory. And then they need to have a violence or coercion, threat of violence. So for this book, I look at intimacy in a very narrow way, in a very reductive way. I only look at two components of private sphere, marriage and sexuality. By marriage and sexuality here, I refer to constellation of intimate relationship encompassing sensual, sexual, and reproductive activities and conjugal relations. And I exclude other different forms of private spheres like religion, lifestyle routine, other familial relationships. And there are different ways the governance of marriage and sexuality have taken place across different insurgent groups. Again, taking core assumptions from state-centric IR, we would expect rebel-governed space to be a space where there is forced marriage and various forms of sexual violence running rampant. To be sure, there are actually rebel groups that actually engage in these sorts of violence. We have seen ISIL close to home in Cameroon. They practice post-marriage. So there are actually this sort of violence taking place. Some of them are quite direct and outright violence, and others are quite nuanced. And we can always argue whether marriage and other sort of relationship in the condition of war are really consensual or non-violent and non-coercive. And the broad literature on forced marriage and sexual violence focuses on 4 different areas. The organizational and interpersonal dimension of forced marriage and sexual violence, that means sexual violence, forced marriage, are used to promote the bonding in armed organization, unit cohesion, and also sometimes they are used as weapon of war framework, particularly coming from various feminist scholars who have focused on that side of war, and then they have also that has resulted in different UN Security Council resolutions, such as 1820. And there is another body of literature that looks at marriage and sexuality as an instrumental way. Jeff Godwin, for example, talks about libidinal withdrawal in rebel organization, how that might weaken or that might consolidate rebel organization, because it essentially means when cadres or combatants, they engage in marriage or they some sort of romantic relationship that might weaken their commitment to rebel political project. But there are also other scholars who have focused on how post-marriage and different sort of sexual violence that take place in armed conflict might be related to the broader political project of that rebel group. But this kind of forced marriage and sexual violence in rebel groups is not universal. Even rebel groups that engage in this sort of violence, there is some nuance. For example, God's Resistance Army that would adopt girls and engage in forced marriage, but they would punish any sort of rape or sexual violence. Again, we can argue about that. In case of LTT close to home in South Asia, initially they didn't allow marriage until Prabhakaran got married in 1984 and then allowed marriage. And similarly, Eritrean Eritrean People's Liberation Front from EPLF also initially banned marriage and that sort of romantic relationship, but later they opened up. But different rebel organizations, such as including Maoist instances in Nepal, the Maoist groups in India, and LTT, they prohibited any sort of sexual violence and any sort of forced marriage. Again, I would like to highlight that I'm defining non-coercion and non-violence in a very narrow way, in a very reductive way. That doesn't mean that forced marriage and sexual violence hasn't taken place. And there might be different sort of violence instead of direct sort of physical violence that might be taking place. So I look at, in this particular chapter, I look at three research questions. And when rebel organizations, they engage in non-coercive and non-violent forms of supposedly non-violent and non-coercive forms of rebel governance, what does it mean for rebel groups' political agendas, and what does it mean for social control and politics of power? Essentially, that's what rebel groups try to do. They want to control, they want to gain political power. What are the gender impact of such ideology and practices? And what happens to, since I started with saying that female combatants, women that participate in political violence, they are not a homogeneous group. What does it mean for female combatants that are at the margin of social hierarchy, that are at the intersection of multiple systems of operation? Okay, there were three regions that I selected, the Maoist incidents in Nepal. They were generally considered to be the most successful. In fact, some would claim that the most successful rebel insurgency, violent political insurgency since 1990s. Again, we can debate about that. So my contention is that they came up with federal Republican governing system. That was their main agenda, and they achieved that. Secondly, one of the defining features of Maoist insurgency in Nepal was the larger participation of women in different sphere of insurgency ecosystem, including as a combatants. So again, there are different numbers, right? When I spoke to Maoist leaders, they said that the numbers were as high as 40%, but then the UN verification showed that 3,846 out of 19,602. That means roughly 20% of the fighting force were women combatant. Finally, the Maoist incidents in Nepal can reveal significant critical insight into the rebel government's marriage and sexuality. They consistently frame their governance of marriage and sexuality as progressive, modern, and scientific. And we can talk about scientific. This is very interesting term that Maoists used, and this is not just the Maoists in Nepal that use scientific progressive terms to characterize the rebellion, and that goes back to the Marxist scholars who tend to present Marxist theory as the most scientific, based on this dialectical materialism and that sort of thing. And I found there's interesting, actually, thread on this. It in some cases evokes that sort of philosophy of science debate, where Karl Popper said that once there is a empirical evidence that contradicts the whole theory, then it should be falsified, right? Falsification. Then Marxists, their prediction was proven wrong, right? They said that it would start from rural areas, like but the Marxist rebellion, communist rebellion, they started in urban areas. So then Imre Lakatos came up with the idea of research program, when he argued that even if the main argument, the core of the research program is protected, if the only auxiliary conjectures are falsified, then that should be fine. It should still retain that sort of scientific value of that knowledge. And then Michael Borawe argued that since Marxist hasn't had a deep reckoning with the historical inaccuracies, there is no reciprocity between this kind of dialectical materialism and the historical inaccuracy. That's one weakness, but it should be considered a scientific theory. When it comes to the Maoist instance in Nepal, the Prachanda, in his interviews in earlier days and in later days, and also in the Maoist statements and the manifestos, they consistently said that the Maoist theorization, the Maoist revolution, is the most scientific. And again, we can base this in the context of 1990s, when Francis Fukuyama said that this is end of the communism, victory of liberal order, and the Maoists were pressured to present themselves as something new in the market. So that's where Prachanda started saying that the Maoist movement in Nepal is the most scientific because it is based on this kind of objective geopolitical situation, socio-political and economic reality of Nepal, and also it is based on this sort of subjective commitment to the communism. And I argue that in using this sort of vernacular, the progressive, modern, and scientific, they applied it to the governance of marriage and sexuality. They contrasted themselves with different rebel organizations. When I spoke to, again, I'm happy to come back to this later, and also you can find that on various speeches and statements, policy statement by Maoist during the Maoist insurgency. They argued that they were different. If you compare that with the Maoist insurgency in India, they had this anti-natalist position. They would allow this sort of romantic relationship, but they won't allow children. If we compare that with FARC in Colombia, another leftist insurgency, again, they would allow this sort of sexual relationship, marriage, but they would force female combatants to use contraceptive. So the Maoists argue that we were the most scientific, we wouldn't stop any sort of biological, if combatants, they have biological need, they should be allowed to, they are adult, they should be allowed to have this sort of relationship, they should be allowed to have family, provided that the relationship is based on consensus, based on love. If they love each other, then they shouldn't be restricted by any sort of feudalistic understanding of a relationship, what ideal relationships should look like. They don't have to be from the same caste, same class, same ethnicity, and that sort of thing. So in that way, the Maoists were presenting themselves in their governance of private sphere as the most scientific group. But then there is this puzzle of rebel groups wading into the private sphere. Even for a well-endowed and well-resourced state, governing private sphere is fraught with various challenges. Right? We see that in the United States, abortion, again, the war between Ukraine and Russia, right? The contestation between progressive gender order versus the natural traditional gender order. We hear that sort of narratives, and even those sort of rich, well-resourced countries, it's difficult to wade into this sort of area. There are numerous costs related to such governance effort. Actually, Megan Stewart argues that she looks at rebel organizations that engage in this sort of intensive form of rebel governance. She finds that the rebel groups that engage in that sort of intensive form of rebel governance are successful in the same way as the rebel groups that don't engage in that sort of intensive and expansive governance. So then why would any rebel group invest intensively in this sort of governance? Why they would use their scarce resource, material resource and human resource, and when they don't have this sort of governance capacity, why would they engage in this sort of activities? So I argue that focusing on this sort of instrumental, tactical and military strategy that I highlighted earlier, I'm happy to come back to that later, only offers a limited understanding of how rebel groups formulate and consolidate their political projects and priorities. So we need to also focus on this sort of political and ideational motivation for governance of marriage and sexuality. And there are some existing explanation why rebel groups might engage in this sort of governance of private sphere. These are symbolic reasons, practical considerations, and revolutionary objectives of rebel groups. Symbolic reasons, Zachariah Mampeli argues that this symbolic form of governance, such as flag, rituals, music, art, are as important for the legitimacy of rebel governance as the tangible and material forms of rebel governance. Isabel Kesser, she looks at Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK, where combatants have to sign an abstinence contract. That means they should vow not to engage in any sort of romantic relationship, sexual relationship, or marriage when they are combatants. So that was to assuage their community by saying that their daughters, their sisters, want their chastity and would be protected at any cost, and we have this system. Again, we can debate that. That's really interesting. And another explanation is that the rebel organizations that are engaged in transformative, that have transformative political projects, they seek to change everything, political institutions, structures. They want to restructure society fundamentally along gender, racial, religious, class, and ethnic lines. and I draw a lot from Eddie Skocpol and Charles Tilly here. But I draw more from sort of feminist scholarship. B. Spike Peterson argues that making a state makes sex. So without regulating the sort of sex or gender, the state becomes ineffectual. The state loses its legitimacy because the state is male. Again, I'm happy to come back to this later, and we can see ramification of this in our citizenship right as well, right? And inheritance right, and how much a feminist movement has to fight for that. So I argue that making sex or gender also makes rebel group and rebel political project. Again, I won't go in deeper. I draw from three bodies of literature here: feminist international relation, rebel governance. I discussed them, and ethnographic works, particularly the works that looks at micro-level social processes of insurgency, and that looks at the sort of quotidian network, kinship, and their importance in terms of rebel, the ecosystem of insurgent movement. Okay, so findings. So I find that, again, I come back to that research questions that I started with for this chapter, not for the book, but this chapter seeks to answer the second question that I try to answer in my book, which is about what sort of insight we can gain if we look at female combatants and their experience in the private sphere. So, 3 questions for the chapter. What does a non-coercive, non-violent rebel governance of marriage and sexuality mean for rebel groups' political agendas, social control, and politics of power within group? What are the gendered impact of such practices of governance? And how does this governance impact women combatants at the intersection of multiple systems of oppression? So, although this is my finding, right? Although the Maoist insurgency in Nepal embellished the governance of marriage and sexuality with powerful loaded terms like science, progress, and modernity, the core mechanism of social control and accumulation of power through the institution of marriage and governance of sexuality remained intact as before. Most importantly, it marginalized women combatants at the intersection of multiple systems of power in terms of gender, class, caste, ethnicity, and geographical location. Let me expand it a little further. The Maoists utilized the libidinal politics, an act of group politicizing and militarizing affectual and sexual ties to amass power. And they also sought to emotionally and psychologically control combatants, female combatants, and other male combatants as well. In other words, the Maoist incident, they became the Maoist group in Nepal, the Maoist incidents, they became a greedy institution that sought to govern not only sexual practices of the combatants, but also their emotional and psychological beings, by monopolizing the commitments of its members. Through governance of marriage and sexuality within the group, the Maoists replaced the traditional institution of marriage with elaborate codes and rules, instrumentalized marriage and sexuality to gain and contain combatants, utilized the politics of martyrdom, and again, I'm happy to come back to this. There's an interesting thinking about martyrdom in social movements, particularly when it comes to leftist movement, and constructed moral order to control bodies, attain and maximize political power. Most importantly, at the core part of my book, it marginalized women combatants at the intersection of multiple oppressions, particularly women combatants from lower caste, lower class, ethnic minority, and social status. They were disproportionately affected by governance of marriage and sexuality. Just to give you a glimpse, I think I'm running out of time, low on time here. So after the Maoist insurgency supposedly end, there was the women combatants who got married during the Maoist insurgency, particularly coming from lower caste background and ethnic minority background. They suffered, not all of them, but there has been tremendous work on this by Asmita Karka, Aruna Raimaji, recording the divorce and domestic violence on combatants, women combatants, especially those coming from lower caste, lower class and ethnic minority background. So there was this sort of diverse, and those Dalit women combatants, they were told by their husband and male combatants that their family wouldn't accept that, their community wouldn't accept that. In many cases, they would go away from the community and settle in a new area that is itself fraught with a lot of challenges. In other cases, the family would disavow, the male combatant would abscond, leaving female combatant pending for herself, and she couldn't go back to her community because, again, female combatants, not just combatants from lower caste and lower class and ethnic minority, but others of they were ostracized. They were considered to be abnormal in their community. So they had to face all those challenges. And when I spoke to the Maoist leaders, was there any program to address these sort of concerns, these sort of problems? There was no sort of systematic answer to that. I think with that, I should stop here. I couldn't get to the findings, but I'm happy to discuss that in the Q&A.
Thank you, Keshab. Now let me open the floor for discussion, comments, questions. You can ask for elaboration.
Actually, so sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you actually mentioned about like policy of martyrdom, like what does it look like in Maoist movement? Would you mind elaborating it further? And also how it actually maximized the political power and also led to the marginalization of women from lower economic background or also caste.
Go ahead.
Can I answer that?
Yeah.
So what's your name?
Dibya.
Thank you for asking the question, Libya. So when it comes to martyrdom in social movement, or in leftist, particularly in leftist movement, there's an interesting myth and also values and qualities assigned to martyrs. I think that's the case in general society, right? The martyrs are held in high regard for their role in social political transformation. In case of Maoist incidents in Nepal, and I do fieldwork in South Asia broadly, and also drawing insight from the Maoist incidents in India, and then also some of the ethnic armed conflict in northeast India. Martyrdom is celebrated, right? It is something to be cherished. And when there is marriage and husband loses wife or wife loses husband, then the rebel groups often does that, okay, this is not the time for wailing or mourning. That's too old-fashioned, right? And this sort of widow system, we don't agree with that sort of system. That's feudal system, that's oppresses you, that is oppressive to particularly women, right? You are not supposed to marry, you are considered to be, you are ostracized. even I remember when I was growing up, widows, like when somebody passes and has important work in that day, and he or she or they see a widow on the road, that is seen as a bad omen, bad luck or something like that. So, particularly Maoist said that we don't, we seek to destroy that sort of norms, that sort of practices. So they said that let's turn this grief into power, and then fight with more strength, vigor, and then smash the enemy. I find that interesting, and it's not to say that that only happens in the left insurgency. That actually happens in the state armies as well, right? When the army in Operation Loses a Friend or something, they said that they are more they become more dangerous. That they fight with added strength and so on. And in one instance, and this is not that did not come during the interview, but I read it somewhere. I'm blanking on the author. She finds that one female combatant, she married two times or three times. She lost her husband, but then she wanted to show that how committed she is to the political objective of the Maoist. She didn't believe in the widow system. So yeah, that was quite interesting to me, and in a way that also helped the Maoist movement, because in a normal situation that would be demoralizing, right? That would hamstrung the insurgency, but they managed to spin that in a way that evokes that strength.
Other questions, comments? So, should we all go? Sounds like the cricket match is going on. Sachin, yeah.
सोधिहाल्नु चाहिँ होइन यो मैले जस अब बुझेअनुसार तपाईँले सर्टन किसिमको म्यारेज इन्स्टिट्युसनलाई चाहिँ अब इन्डिकेटर मानेर कसरी पोलिटिसाइजेसन अफ प्राइभेट स्पेयर भयो भने मलाई अलिकति तपाईँले एकदम थ्योरिटिकल इन्टरप्रिटेसन गरिरहनु भएको थियो, अनि अलिक बढी इम्पेरिकल कुरामा बेस भएर थ्योरिटिकल इन्टरप्रिटेसन हुन्छ कि भन्ने थियो, तर पछि मात्रै एभिडेन्सहरू इम्पेरिकल एभिडेन्सहरू होइन यो ट्राई टु ब्रिङ प्रेजेन्टेसन. सो मैले चाहिँ के सुन्नु खोजेको थिएँ भने जस्तै अब अहिले सुन्दाखेरि चाहिँ अब अहिले सपोर्ट गरे जस्तो हुन्छ, तर केही अब नराम्रो कुरा हामी नेपालीले पनि सबै थाहा पाइसक्यो, राम्रो कुरा पनि थाहा पाइसक्यो. जस्तै अब वारकै बेलामा कलम साटेर पनि म्यारेज गरेका थिए, भित्रै किताब साटेर पनि गरेका थिए, मसाल साटेर पनि गरेका थिए जसम्म मलाई सम्झेअनुसार. तर जुन कास्टको जुन खालको नेपाली कम्युनिटीको ट्रेडिसनल म्यारेजको ह्याङओभरबाट आए मान्छे र माओवाइस्ट नामको पोलिटिकल डोमेनमा छिरेर उनीहरूले फरक किसिमको म्यारेज प्र्याक्टिस गरे नि, त्यो चाहिँ अघि चाहिँ तपाईँले भने दुईवटा वर्ड चाहिँ कता कता हो कि जस्तो लाग्छ. तर मलाई एउटा सम्झना चाहिँ के आइरहेको छ भने म्यारेज आफैलाई उनीहरूले वैज्ञानिक चाहिँ भनेको थिए कि थिएन, प्रेम गर्नुलाई चाहिँ सांस्कृतिक अराजकता चाहिँ भनेको थिए. अनि पछि जब बिहे गरे त्यो बेलामा चाहिँ उनीहरूले त्यो बेला त नेपाली समाज त भयङ्कर दाइजो लिएर बिहे गर्ने चलन, तर कलम साटेर मसल साटेर किताब साटेर बिहे गरेर त त्यो बेलाको एक्जिस्टिङ समाजभन्दा त एक अर्थमा प्रोग्रेसिभ पनि त भएको थियो नि त्यो भित्रको इन्स्टिट्युसनल प्र्याक्टिसहरू. अब अहिले तपाईँले भन्दा चाहिँ किसिमको म्यारेजमा सेक्सुअलिटी र बोथ चाहिने मान्छेको पर्सनल चाहिँ लिबर्टीहरूलाई असाध्यै बढी पोलिटिसाइज गरियो भन्यो. तर त्यो लिबरेटिङ चाहिँ थियो कि थिएन त, चाहे माइक्रो कजममै भए पनि जसले गरे होला माओवाइस्टहरूले त्यो इस्टाब्लिस गरेर संस्कारले लार्जर डोमेनमा सोसाइटल ट्रान्सफर्मेसनमा त्यही म्यारेज नामको इन्स्टिट्युसनलाई ट्रान्सफर्म गर्न आज इन्गेजमेन्ट पछि बिहेको बिचमा मेहन्दी कल्चर आएर थपिसक्यो. हाम्रो बिहे त झनै महँगो भएर गएको छ, बिहेमा पेन्टिङ सुद्धा आएर थपिसक्यो. माओवाइस्टहरूले जुन बिजारोपण गरेका थिए त्यसले लार्जर सोसाइटल म्यारेज सिस्टमको ट्रान्सफर्मेसनमा त त्यत्रो ठुलो त रोल खेलेन, तर मैले तसम्म जुन बेला जे गरेँ त्यही मान्छेहरूलाई चाहिँ तपाईँको विचारमा लिबरेटिङ चाहिँ थियो कि थिएन भन्ने कुरा मैले सोध्नु खोजेँ। अब त्यो अब
बुझ्यो
That's a great question. I would say I'm not here to say that this is right or wrong. Am I right or wrong? When the question is, and this is about narratives, right? There are multiple truths. त्यो पनि हो तपाईले भन्ने कुरा social transformation. I felt that. I know Taiju. I intimately know it. I know their personal story about it, but I know about that. Transformation भएको तर ट्रान्सफर्मेसनमा कस्ता स्टोरीहरूलाई बढी प्रायोरिटी दिइन्छ हैन। प्रायः जस्तो कस्तो हुन्छ भने स्याक्रिफाइस धेरै किसिमको स्याक्रिफाइस हुन्छ हैन। अनि कुनै पनि सोसल मुभमेन्ट पोलिटिकल मुभमेन्ट कम्प्युटर गर्दाखेरि धेरै जस्तो के हुन्छ एन्ट्रोसेन्ट्रिक बायस हुन्छ कि ठुल्ठुला स्पेक्टाकुलर कुराहरू यतिजना मार्यो यो कब्जा गर्यो भन्नेमा बढी फोकस हुन्छ हैन। अनि फेरि त्यो गर्नको लागि त्यो लेबर सोसल रिप्रोडक्सन कति चाहिन्छ र त्यो कुरा चाहिँ त्यति आउँदैन। अनि त्यसमा चाहिँ धेरै जस्तो के भनिन्छ भने यस्ता कुराहरू दिनु हुँदैन ठुल्ठुला सोसल मुभमेन्ट हुँदाखेरि। विशेष गरेर महिलाहरूलाई के हुन्छ भने यो इम्पोर्टेन्ट कुरा होइन अहिले हैन। हामी ठुल्ठुला कुराहरू ठुल्ठुला पोलिटिकल प्रोजेक्ट्सहरूमा फोकस हुनुपर्छ। त्यसपछि अरू कुराहरू त तफसिलका कुराहरू तिनीहरू आफै परिवर्तन भइहाल्छ नि भन्ने हुन्छ हैन। मैले चाहिँ त्यो मार्जिनलाइज पर्सपेक्टिभबाट मात्र स्टोरी प्रेजेन्ट गरेको। मैले चाहिँ माओवादीहरूको जुन अचिभमेन्ट छ त्यसलाई चाहिँ इन्भ्यालिडेट गर्न खोजेको चाहिँ होइन है। अनि मेरो किताबमा त्यही नै छ। मैले चाहिँ न्यारेटिभ गर्छु नि, देयर आर मल्टिपल न्यारेटिभ्स र कुनै पनि न्यारेटिभहरू चाहिँ हेजेमोनी हुनु हुँदैन कुनै पनि न्यारेटिभको। अनि त्यो नै एउटा मलाई लाग्छ प्लुरल सोसाइटी हैन डेमोक्रेटिक सोसाइटीको एउटा स्योर साइन हो जस्तो लाग्छ। जब हामीले चाहिँ डिफ्रेन्ट न्यारेटिभहरू बिचमा संवाद सुरु गर्छौँ त्यसले नै त्यहाँ अल्टिमेट ट्रुथ भन्ने कुरा त हुँदैन हैन। अब माओइस्ट ल्याङ्ग्वेजमा हुँदाखेरि सिन्थेसिस के भन्छ एन्टिथेसिस थेसिस एन्टिथेसिस सिन्थेसिस भन्छ नि। त्यसैले नै हाम्रो समाजलाई चाहिँ मोर लर्न्ड हैन मोर नुआन्स्ड बनाउँछ जस्तो लाग्छ।
Other questions?
Yes, a question.
I just wanted some insight on like Maoist hegemonic narrative. How, like, what's your perception on that?
Could you say it again? तपाईँको नाम भन्नुहोस् न।
Bidikson Sumi.
Sorry?
Bidikson. B-I-D-I.
Can you actually elaborate what you're asking?
Yeah, I'm trying to understand like how is this narrative being spread? Your hegemonic.
हेजेमोनिक न्यारेटिभ के हो भन्न खोज्नु भएको?
No, like your Maoist ko hegemonic narrative छ नि हैन? Like what is it like?
अब यसमा पनि मैले चाहिँ अब तपाईलाई एथनोग्राफी अफ माई बुकबाट स्टार्ट गर्छु है त। मैले जब फिल्डवर्क सुरु गर्नु भएको थिएँ म एसएक्सबाट मैले मास्टर्स गरेँ। एसएक्स तपाईँले चाहिँ क्वान्टिटेटिभ रिसर्चको लागि तपाईँ नाम छ होइन। मेरो प्लान के थियो भने आएर चाहिँ एउटा ठुलो सर्भे म्यासिभ सर्भे गर्ने अनि फिमेल कम्ब्याटेन्ट्सहरूको एक्सपिरियन्स के रहेछ त्यसलाई चाहिँ स्ट्याटिस्टिकल मोडलिङ डिफ्रेन्ट मोडलिङबाट क्वान्टिफाई गरेर एउटा ठुलो जर्नलमा Q1 जर्नलमा JPR जर्नल पेस रिसर्च जर्नल कन्फ्लिक्ट रेजोल्युसन त्यस्तोमा प्रेजेन्ट गर्ने थियो। र जब म आएर कुरा सुन्न सुरु गरेँ इट वाज कम्प्लेक्स द स्टोरी वाज कम्प्लेक्स द एक्सपिरियन्स वाज कम्प्लेक्स डिपेन्डेड अन हु आई टक टु। मैले चाहिँ काठमाडौँदेखि स्टार्ट गरेँ अर्बन सेन्टरहरूमा गएँ होइन। अनि अपारेन्टली अर्बन सेन्टरहरूमा काठमाडौँमा चाहिँ अब लिडरहरूसँग भेटघाट हुन्छ। उहाँहरूको कुरा सुन्दाखेरि चाहिँ अब वी गट अ लट अफ सोसल ट्रान्सफर्मेसन यसमा चाहिँ हाम्रो माओवादीको ठुलो हात छ जस्तो कुराहरू पनि आयो। अनि फेरि धेरै चाहिँ वुमेन्स इम्पावरमेन्टहरू भएको छ। हामी त्यतिखेर चाहिँ म गर्दाखेरि राष्ट्रपति पनि पछि हुनुभयो पहिला चाहिँ स्पिकर अफ द हाउस होइन अनि फेरि चिफ जस्टिस पनि उहाँ पनि वुमेन नै हुनुहुन्थ्यो अनि फेरि भन्दाखेरि अब हो यो नेटिभ नै ठिक हो जस्तो पनि लाग्यो होइन ठिक पनि थियो तर जब म चाहिँ अलि दूर दराजतिर जान आएँ अलि 7वटा क्यान्टनमेन्ट एन्ड सेटेलाइट 28वटा सेटेलाइट क्यान्टनमेन्टको वरिपरि रोडपारोकोहरू त्यहाँ जाँदाखेरि स्टोरी वाज भेरी डिफरेन्ट अनि एउटा कमन डिनोमिनेटर चाहिँ के थियो भने यसो ख्याल गर्दाखेरि तपाईँको कास्ट क्लास अनि फेरि जियोग्राफिकल लोकेसन अनि फेरि सोसल क्यापिटल भनौँ न ले चाहिँ कतिसम्म इम्पावर्ड हुने कतिसम्म सत्ताको नजिक बस्न पाउने पोजिसन अफ पावरमा प्रिभिलेजमा आउन पाउने भन्ने त्यो लागेको देखियो अनि त्यसपछि चाहिँ मैले चाहिँ इम्प्रोभाइज गर्न सुरु गरेँ भने त्यहाँ चाहिँ केही होलहरू त्यो नेगेटिभमा त्यो ओभरअल नेगेटिभ ट्रान्सफर्मेसनमा देख्न सुरु गरेँ अनि त्यही नै हो भन्नाले एउटा म्यासिभ टोटलाइजिङ नेगेटिभ छ त्यसको साथसाथमा चाहिँ तपाईँले इट डिपेन्ड्स अन हु यु आस्क त्यसको आधारमा चाहिँ त्यो ट्रुथहरू चाहिँ डिफ्रेन्ट छ स्क्याटर सो हाउ डु आई मेक सेन्स अफ द्याट मैले एट द एन्ड चाहिँ के गरेँ भने यो क्वान्टिफाई गर्नु त यसलाई सकिँदैन अनि गर्दाखेरि क्रिटिकल फेमिनिस्ट lens and it becomes intersectional lens, but it made perfect sense to me.
Yes, Sarah.
I have 2 questions. One is related to methodology. You talked about being situating yourself. Ages ago, I read your dissertation, methodology section, and I just started with you again. And there's a lot of emphasis in this and in your dissertation that you are as a man, cisgender, blah blah blah, with this certain sort of identity, rural background, certain ways in building rapport, but it affects your situations. For me, there wasn't enough about your caste and how that affected your interviews. It was very Korean here, so it's just like 2-3 sentences and also my caste, but most of the emphasis is you being male. And for Nepali Samaj, as you know, caste is really up there in how you are seen in society. So if you could tell us more about whether caste came up or how you managed to negotiate your, despite you being from a rural background, blah blah blah, everything else you did. Caste is quite hegemonic in certain places, in a lot of places. I gathered that most of your respondents were from marginalized groups, so I can't see that not being a problem when they were talking to you anymore, beyond English university and that to me would have been, for me, I thought, yeah, okay, I get that, but I would get the caste more, men being male in the caste, so if you could talk about that, that'd be great. The second is this, you did a lot of theory, but we didn't get into the meat of your book. So if you could talk more about this marginalization of female ex-combatants of multiple oppressions and structures. So how did that come? How did that show up in your book? Like how were they more marginalized because of this regulation of this governance of the marriage system? If you want to go through detailing about it.
The question to you.
So why don't you answer Sarah's question?
Thank you. Sarahji, methodology मा चाहिँ मैले कास्टको कुरा चाहिँ धेरै गरेको छैन होइन एउटा दुईटा लाइनमा मात्रै गरेको छु होइन I think it mattered होइन it did definitely mattered but I could have engaged more यसमा कास्टको कुरा गर्दाखेरि एउटा सिचुएसनको कुरा गर्दाखेरि चाहिँ म बिजुली फेरि नगरौँ अनि त्यहाँ जाँदाखेरि चाहिँ दलित हुनुहुन्थ्यो I think she hesitated a lot me speaking being म साँझको समयमा गएको थिएँ अनि फेरि एज अ मेल अनि त्यतिखेर चाहिँ त्यो मात्र होइन अरू बेला मेरो चाहिँ पर्मिसन लिएर तिमी चाहिँ मेरो इन्टरभ्यू चाहिँ तपाईँले युज गर्न सक्नुहुन्छ भनेर गरेको चाहिँ 39 जति होला तर चाहिँ मैले चाहिँ गर्न चाहिँ 60-70 जति गरेको थिएँ इन्टरभ्यू अरूले चाहिँ दे विथड्रु कन्सेन्ट मलाई लाग्छ यो कतिपय कन्सेप्टहरू गर्दाखेरि त्यसमा दलित पनि हुनुहुन्थ्यो अनि उहाँले सायद यो अभिजातीय वर्गको मान्छेले मेरो दुःख कसरी बुझ्न सक्ला भन्ने त्यो पनि जस्तो लाग्छ I should have engaged more on that, but I could not ascertain केले गर्दाखेरि उहाँहरूले त्यो विथड्र गर्नुभयो त्यसमा चाहिँ सायद नुवान्स वेमा म चाहिँ इन्गेज गर्न सक्थेँ होला हो यसमा चाहिँ अलि सिरियसली नै मैले लाग्नुपर्ने जस्तो लाग्यो त्यसमा चाहिँ एउटा चाहिँ ठुलो हाम्रो सोसाइटीमा दिस इज अ पावरफुल सोसल क्याटेगोरी they should have engaged it in more sustained way.
What's important, for example, reading W. It's also clear that when I read dissertation years ago, clearly it's meant for a Western audience. You keep up, but the dissertation work it's clearly for a Western audience. And the Nepali audience will know about exactly what issue So that's quite visible in this methodology section and in your dissertation. So one is an old thing that Professor and I constantly raise is who your audiences imagine when you write stuff like this. And clearly, this is not for a Nepali audience. So it's independent. When I remember this so that is a reflection, I think, of that kind of moment.
Oh, यसमा चाहिँ धेरै कुराहरू क्या नलेज प्रोडक्सनमा त्यो थुप्रै भेरिएबलहरू हुन्छ होइन यसमा चाहिँ अब हामीले कस्तो ठाउँमा पब्लिस गर्ने को अडियन्स राख्ने त्यो कुराहरू हुन्छ सायद यसमा म अझै इन्गेज गर्न चाहन्छु त्यसैको लागि अर्को प्रोजेक्टमा चाहिँ मैले चाहिँ फेमिनिस्ट मुभमेन्ट फ्रम मार्जिन त्यसमा चाहिँ विशेष साउथ एसियामा मार्जिनबाट दलित फेमिनिस्टहरू विशेष गरेर उहाँहरूको पर्सपेक्टिभहरूबाट गर्ने अनि यसमा चाहिँ अझै म सस्टेन वेमा इन्गेज गर्न अब इन्गेज भन्नाले अब त्यो इट्स अ डबल एज सोर्ड होइन र एउटा कुरा चाहिँ म इन्गेज गर्छु त्यति भएर म चाहिँ आई क्यान एब्जर्भ फ्रम माई अब मेरो नर्मेटिभ रेस्पोन्सिबिलिटी पुरा गरेँ देखेको त छु नि भन्ने एउटा पार्ट भयो अर्को चाहिँ प्र्याक्टिसमा के गर्छु होइन वाट आई डु इन प्र्याक्टिस मेरो पोलिटिक्स के हो त्यो पनि अर्को कुरा हुन्छ होइन there are different ways of engaging with it. I'm still grappling with it. Your privilege, I cannot escape away from, no matter how I don't want my privilege. It follows me. You know, my privilege or my power as a male, as a abhijati varga high caste male. Kurupma त्यो आई नै रहेको हुन्छ यसले नै अब म रोल्पातिर बिजुलीतिर जान सक्नु कारण म मेल म हाई कास्टको भएर नै हो होइन सायद दलित भएर म जान्थेँ म कतिपय मलाई इन्टरभ्यूबाट नै इग्नोर गर्नुहुन्थ्यो होला होइन दे वुडन्ट ह्याभ अलाउड मी टु इन्टरभ्यू द्याट तिनीहरूको घरमा बसेर उनीहरूसँग पानी खाँदै
This teacher would have made it more interesting
Yes,
for us.
yes, definitely.
And that then really you would have established yourself from a situated
Absolutely.
point. And here it's just truncated.
Yeah.
It's a very Western related. They only know about cisgender and about male. It's more sara ananda, yeah. And the gravity of what you were doing and the consequences for your findings, it's ananda.
Are you done?
Yeah.
Did you want to ask something?
Yes.
Yeah.
नमस्ते मेरो चाहिँ क्वेसन होइन जस्ट मेरो पर्सपेक्टिभ हो यो चाहिँ हजुरले जस्तो फिमेल कम्ब्याटेन्ससँग कुरा गर्दा मैले पनि 2010तिर चाहिँ फिमेल कम्ब्याटेन्ससँग कुरा गर्ने मौका पाएको थिएँ अनि स्पेसली मैले पनि सोधेको थिएँ उहाँहरूको बिहाको चाहिँ कस्तो भयो भनेर उहाँहरूले भन्नुभएको थियो कि हामीले चाहिँ रिङ साटेनौँ हामीले चाहिँ बन्दुक साट्यौँ अनि उहाँहरूले भन्नुभएको थियो कि हामीले चाहिँ यो हिन्दूको मन्त्र जपेनौँ हाम्रो मार्क्सको फिलोसफीहरू भन्यौँ होइन लाल सलाम गऱ्यौँ हात उठायौँ र यो सबै इभेन्ट्सहरू हेर्दा मलाई के लाग्छ भने यो हामीले उहाँहरूको बिहाको सिस्टमले लिबरेसन गर्यो कि गरेन भन्ने कुरा चाहिँ त्यो लिबरेसनको चाहिँ हामीले लङ टर्म हेर्नुपर्छ जस्तो लाग्छ एउटा मात्र इभेन्टले ल अहिले इन्टरकास्ट छ बिहा गरिहालौँ अथवा चाहिँ ल सुन्न ल बन्दुक साटौँ भन्नु त्योले होइन कि यो चाहिँ लङ टर्ममा हामीले चाहिँ जसरी बन्दुक साट्दा हामी इक्वल छौँ भनेर त्यो एउटा हुन्छ त्यसै गरी लाइफमा उनीहरूले पावर एक्सर्साइज गर्न पाए कि पाएनन् होइन जस्तो रिलिजन उनीहरूले चाहिँ मन्त्र गरेनन् मन्त्र नगरेकोले गर्दा भोलि पर्सि हिन्दुइजमले जुन वुमेनलाई डिस्क्रिमिनेसन गर्ने अन्त त्योबाट चाहिँ उनीहरूले पाए कि पाएनन् त बाहिर निस्किन त्यसैले चाहिँ त्यो एउटा चाहिँ अलिकति लामो टाइम फ्रेमलाई हेरेर मात्रै त्यो साँच्चै नै त्यो मुभमेन्टले चाहिँ वुमेनको गर्यो कि गरेन भनेर हेर्न मिल्छ होला जस्तो लाग्छ त्यही
The liberation is a long-term project and long-term process. I think that's what it is. I believe in that. I know because liberation different sphere, different level. I'm saying spectacular, exceptional, spectacular event or like focus person. Actually, lived experience like IR मा सबै छैन सोशल साइन्स मा सायद तपाईहरुले गर्नुभएको छ होला सोशल साइन्समा लिभ एक्सपिरियन्सहरुलाई सायद उनलाई फोकस गरे भने हामी चाहिँ वही कता वर्गको कुराहरुलाई अझै अगाडि ल्याउन सक्छौं जस्तो लाग्छ अनि यस्तो भन्दै गर्दा चाहिँ सिपी अर्यालजी हुनुहुन्छ उहाँले पनि महिला लडाकुहरूको म्यारेजको बारेमा सोशल फोर्सले कसरी उनीहरुको पर्सपेक्टिभलाई असर पार्छ इन्फ्लुएन्स गर्छ भनेर गर्नुभएको छ मार्टिन चौतारीमै पहिला प्रेजेन्ट पनि गर्नुभएको छ जस्ट अ लिटल प्लग दिस अमेजिङ वर्क
There are no other questions. I think the issue that several people have already raised is I perfectly recognize that you're now based in a particular university in north of the UK. So you write books to advance in your career. I actually get that. I've worked with people who based in those sorts of universities for all my adult life. What was really disappointing about your book is your book has, for the first 52 pages of your book, you're still locating your project. Your ethnography actually does not even begin there. When CP reviewed your book in the page of Kathmandu Post in June of 25, he said, obviously, all kinds of people can read this book. It's not only for academics. I think this book is for academics. There is no doubt about that. Non-academics चाहिँ पहिलो कुनै किताब पढ्न थाल्दाखेरि the book is only 130 pages long. They will not have the patience to read through 52 pages of the book saying, I'm still locating my project. They want to actually hear the story first. So I think CP is wrong when he says this is a book for all kinds of people. I think this is a book for academics. I get that point. So you're now based in a university, you're writing for academics. I get that point. What is really disappointing is के भन्दाखेरि चाहिँ अहिले जसलाई हामीले पोजिसनालिटीको नाम अन्तर्गत छलफल गर्छौं नि पोजिसनालिटी इज नट जस्ट योर पर्सनल बायोग्राफी gender, caste, where you might have grown up. Positionality is just what you are actually building upon. In the corpus of knowledge, how are you positioning yourself to build upon that knowledge? Right? You have a bibliography that is 25 pages long. But I didn't count the number of entries there. But I couldn't even find 5 entries that were not in English. And you spent quite a bit of time today talking about how in the Maoist scheme of things, they use the word progressive, scientific, etc. to describe their worldviews on marriage and on much of other things. What have you actually read that's not cited in the book that actually then allows you to be talking about this? I would like to see that. किनभने मैले यो पढेको छु उनीहरुको यो संसारमा यो छ that you cannot say if you're not exhibiting that in the book. I'm a historian, right? Evidence and context is everything for you. In a way, I don't really give a shit about what your discipline IR says about marriage, sexuality, and the whole era of combatants that we passed through 96 to 2000. For me, what does this book teach me as a Nepali who does not do research on that subject, but who's a student of social science and largely works on the 20th century. So this is my question. When you are actually positioning yourself to write this book, why is it that you read so little Nepali text to actually position yourself? So you need to answer that question. When you don't do that, what are the chances that you think exists in the book actually teaching good, substantial new stuff to people who would consider themselves to be students of Nepal and not students of IR. Because at some point, if you're not teaching enough to the students of Nepal, then you're not actually taking the research you do very seriously. I know. I'll stop there. I could go on, but I'll just stop there.
Bullshit त नहुने यही हुन्थ्यो एनिवे पोलिटिक्स अफ साइटेसनको कुरा गर्नुभएको होइन
Sorry, no. That's your language. I didn't use that language. Political citation भनेको त तपाईले कसलाई साइट गर्नुहुन्छ, that's your politics. If you want to go ahead and do that, हैन, त्यो that's fine.
कुरो एउटै हो
हैन, त्यो एउटै होइन.
मलाई आइआर स्कलर हुन दिनु न आज
हैन. आइआर स्कलर हुन पाइन्छ. तर तपाईको सब्जेक्ट पोजिसन बारे तपाईले यस्तो चिन्ता गर्दाखेरि चाहिँ यसलाई यति नेग्लेक्ट गर्न पाइदैन भनेको के मैले.
म त्यहाँ आउँदैछु टर्म्सबाट सुरु गरेँ तपाईँले नेपाली भन्दाखेरि नेपालीमै लेखेको भन्नुभएको हो कि नेपालको बारेमा नेपालीले लेखेको भन्नुभएको हो कि नेपालको बारेमा अरूले
यसो भनौँ न, यसो भनौँ न, यो प्रश्नले के अजुम गर्नु पर्यो भन्दाखेरि चाहिँ नेपालमा जनयुद्ध कालभन्दा अगाडिदेखि नै there's a large theoretical Marxist literature produced by people on the left, intellectual left, हैन. 99% of that was produced in the Nepali language. Right? They have found no space in your book. So, मेरो कुरा चाहिँ के हो भन्दाखेरि, if you're not taking that corpus seriously, how is the reader to believe anything that you've talked about on what they consider scientific, progressive, modern? Why should the reader, take you seriously if you haven't actually passed through that corpus? So, कतिवटा citation नेपालीमा भएको छ, I don't care. I just said 25 पेजमा मैले धेरै थोरै देखेँ, हैन? So that allows me, the historian, to then suggest the question that I put forward to you.
Again, I agree with the general direction of your question. They say organic to literature terms. त्यसलाई पढ्नुपर्छ हैन त्यो बुझ्नको लागि सायद मैले त्यो मार्क्सिस्ट लिटरेचर जुन भन्नुभयो 90% 99% नेपालीमा लेखेको छ भनेर भन्नुभयो त्यो सायद पढेको भए मेरो प्रोजेक्ट अझै एनरिच हुन्थ्यो होला तर मैले त्यो चाहिँ पढेन आइ एम इन्ट्रेस्टेड हैन तर त्यो भन्दै गर्दा चाहिँ मैले चाहिँ माओइस्ट डकुमेन्टहरू माओइस्ट मेरो चाहिँ फोकस के थियो भने माओइस्ट इन्सुरेन्सी स्टार्ट भएपछिको माओइस्टको पोलिसी स्टेटमेन्टहरू स्पिचेसहरू डकुमेन्टहरू उनीहरूको इन्टरभ्यूहरू कि माओइस्ट लिडरहरूको त्यसमा फोकस गरेको थिएँ अनि साथसाथमा चाहिँ मार्क्सिस्ट लिटरेचर बारे चाहिँ उनीहरूले चाहिँ यो सोसाइटीलाई हेर्ने चाहिँ साइन्स क्वेसनमा कसरी डिल गरेको छ भनेर त्यो हेरेको थिएँ मैले मेरो बुक चाहिँ पर्फेक्ट छ भने त कहिल्यै क्लेम गर्दैन आई थिङ्क नो बुक इज पर्फेक्ट but thank you. I take your feedback on board.
It's very. I don't expect copy editors in Oxford because I've worked with many of these folks, right, to actually know the titles of journals. You cite exactly one thing from the journal that three of us in this room edit, and you got that title wrong. I found that quite amazing. Anyway, other question. So if you're wondering which entry in the bibliography, it's Mary Desi in 97. You check the title is wrong. Yeah, Satya.
तो अघि गाडी सोधेको क्वेसन मलाई सोध्न मन लागेको थियो तर अब यो अलि स्ट्यान्डर्ड इङ्ग्लिस बोलेर म जस्तो काम चलाउ इङ्ग्लिस
No, असम्म यार.
I should have dared to ask.
नेपालीमै बोलिरहेको छु
I should also prepare some time भनेर नि मैले अलिकति कस्तो भन्दाखेरि अब यहाँ एक्जोलोजिकल कास्टको पोजिसनालिटीलाई एउटा के हो इफेक्ट गरेन भने एक्जोलोजिकल कन्सर्नको क्वेसन त आइ नै हाल्यो मलाई अलिकति यो तपाईँसँग अब तपाईँको युनिभर्सिटी स्कुलको मान्छेसँग एउटा रिसर्च प्याराडाइममा पनि एउटा सोल समथिङ सोल इज मैले नबुझे जस्तो भयो क्या अनि सोल इज मिसिङ हो कि मैले नबुझे हो भनेर वाट आर सपोज टु आस्क भन्ने चाहिँ के कुरा देखियो भनेदेखि जस्तै अब माउस मुभमेन्ट आफैमा एउटा ओन्टोलोजिकल्ली एउटा एकदमै कम्प्लेक्स एकदमै लार्ज एकदमै एउटा ठुलो होल हो नि त त्यो एउटा सोसियल इन्टिटीको रूपमा होइन त्यसमा तपाईँले एउटा पार्टिकुलर एउटा चाहिँ नि पोलिटिसाइजेसन अफ प्राइभेट स्पेस भनेर म्यारेज इन्स्टिट्युसनमा लिनु अब अलिकति मैले सुन्न खोजेको कुरो चाहिँ जस्तै तपाईँले अहिले मेथोलोजिकल कन्सर्नको पनि कुरा आयो दिदीले स्पष्ट सुन्नुभयो मेथोलोजी चाहिँ के भनेर अब यो अहिले अटो इथनोग्राफिक फेसनमा अथवा क्रिटिकल इथनोग्राफिक अथवा जनरल इथनोग्राफिक फेसन अलिकति अब जस्तै क्रिटिकल फेमिनिजम एज अ थ्योरिटिकल मोडल यो मलाई जहाँसम्म लाग्छ यसले ओन्टोलोजिकल्ली मेथोलोजिकल होलिजमै सपोर्ट गर्छ होइन यो इन्डिभिजुअलिस्ट टाइपको थ्योरी त होइन किनभने तपाईँले क्रिटिकल फेमिनिजम लिइसकेपछि त यसले त अलिकति हुने अब त्यसमा अलिकति मैले चाहिँ नबुझेको कुरा चाहिँ अब क्रिटिकल फेमिनिजम थ्योरिटिकल लेन्स लिने रिसर्च वर्ल्ड आफैमा प्लुरलिस्ट ओन्टोलोजीको छ ओन्टोलोजिकली यो एकदमै प्लुरलिजम हुने खालको अनि लास्टमा लिएर चाहिँ मोनस्टिक डिडक्टिभिजम गरेर अनि एकदमै त्यो सेक्सुअलिटीको कुरामा मात्रै न्यारो रिडक्सन गर्दाखेरि चाहिँ ओभरअल तपाईँको रिसर्च प्याराडाइम चाहिँ ठ्याक्कै चाहिँ मिसम्याच हुन्छ कि हुँदैन कि यो पर्सनल चोइस हो कि कन्फ्युजन हो कि मैले नबुझे हो कि होइन किनभने सोसल रियालिटी एउटा किसिमको छ थ्योरिटिकल लेन्सले एउटा कुरा भन्छ तपाईँ कन्क्लुजनमा आइपुग्नुहुन्छ एक ठाउँमा भइसकेपछि यो हामीले बुझ्न नसके कि यो भएकै यस्तै हो कि भनेर अलिकति मलाई नै सोध्नु मन लाग्यो
तपाईँले मैले भन्दा ओन्टोलोजिकल एपिस्टेमोलोजिकल कुराहरू भयो अलिक मेरै तहमा कुराहरू हो नि त होइन अब मलाई त्यो एसेटोरिक स्कलर बुझ्नुहुन्छ भने यो एउटा प्रोजेक्ट हो है यो प्रोजेक्टले सबै मेरो बारेमा डिफाइन गर्न सक्दैन होइन मैले के गरिरहेको छु अब सेराजीले भने जस्तै पतिसीले भने जस्तै यसबाट चाहिँ अरू थुप्रै कुराहरू गर्न मिल्छ होइन यसमा चाहिँ मैले दुईवटा क्वेसनमा फोकस गरेर त्यसलाई आन्सर गर्ने कोसिस गरेको त्यो आन्सर पनि मैले चाहिँ अब एकाडेमियामा आइआरमा अब कसरी कस्तोलाई आन्सर मानिन्छ भने त्यो एपिस्टेमोलोजिकल मान्यतामा ओन्टोलोजिकल मान्यतामा आधारित भएर गरेको त्यसलाई चाहिँ हिस्टोरियन त्यसलाई चाहिँ फाल्तु पनि ठान्न सक्नुहुन्छ होला होइन त्यसमा चाहिँ एथ्नोग्राफरले अर्कै रूपले पनि लिन सक्नुहुन्छ र म चाहिँ कम्प्लिटली एथ्नोग्राफर पनि होइन होइन म चाहिँ एक दुई वर्षमा पनि केही महिनाहरू बिताएँ भनेदेखि आफूलाई एथ्नोग्राफर भनेर मैले कोडिङ गर्न पनि देख्दैन मैले भन्न खोजेको के भने इट्स नट अ पर्फेक्ट त्यो बुक चाहिँ यो यसमा एभ्रिथिङ एभ्री पर्सनको लागि होइन होइन उहाँले भनिसक्नुभएछ यो एकाडेमिक अडियन्सको लागि हो र तपाईँले हेर्दाखेरि चाहिँ मलाई अलि ग्रेस के माइन्ड राखिदिनुहोस् भने म चाहिँ कलेज गएर स्कलर हो म चाहिँ पहिला चाहिँ आफ्नो पोजिसन बनाएपछि मात्र म आफ्नो फ्रिली आई क्यान एक्सप्लोर वाट आई वान्ट टु होइन त्यो गर्दाखेरि इसेन्सियली त्यसका आफ्नै लिमिटेसनहरू पनि हुन्छन् होइन म आफू पनि आफै कन्सटेन्टहरूबाट गुज्रिनुपर्छ त्यो भन्नुको अर्थ तपाईँहरूले गर्नुभएको महत्त्वपूर्ण क्वेसनहरूलाई मैले व्यवस्था गर्न खोजेको भनेको चाहिँ होइन
अनि एउटा कुरा जस्तै मैले
तपाईँको आन्सर चाहिँ मैले तपाईँको क्वेसन चाहिँ आन्सर गरेन होइन
जस्तै एथ्नोग्राफी भन्ने एन्थ्रोपोलोजिकल टुल हो इट इज नट नेसेसरी टु बिकम एन एथ्नोग्राफर होइन टु एक्सप्लोर टु अनराइवल द एथ्नोग्राफिक पेकुल्यारिटिज अफ दिस वर्ल्ड होइन without mentioning the term called ethnography also simply you can explore or you can interpret the ethnographic peculiarities of this world in the मैले भन्नु मलाई कता कता मनमा चाहिँ कस्तो लागिरहे सधैँभरि मेरो एन्थ्रोपोलोजिकल बायसेस हुनसक्छ तपाईँको होल रिसर्च वर्ल्डले चाहिँ कता कता एकदमै डिटेलिङ एथ्नोग्राफिक पेकुल्यारिटिजहरू एमिक एप्रोचहरू एकदमै त्यो डिमान्ड गरिरहेछ तर कता कता तपाईँ चाहिँ वान साइडेड चिज मात्रै लिएर यो इङ्ग्लिसमा धेरै समथिङ द लोभ साइडेड भन्छ नि लोभ साइडेड मात्रै लिएर चाहिँ तपाईँको एकदमै ललाई जेनरलाइजेसन गर्नुभयो कि भन्ने मात्रै यो अङ्ग्रेजी नबुझेर यस्तो भयो कि भएकै यस्तो भयो भने
यो अङ्ग्रेजी नबुझेको कुरा नदराउँ अङ्ग्रेजी नबुझ्नेले अलिक इपिस्टेमोलोजिकल र ओन्टोलोजिकल जवाब दिँदैन ल सचिन बुझ्यो कुरा अरू कुरा केही छ अहिले पनि
मात्र त्यो भएको अलिक नुआन्सेस म त होइन राम्रो रिपोर्ट गर्नुपर्छ
होइन धन्यवाद होइन त्यसको लागि
यो केशवजीलाई अलिकति एउटा कुरा चाहिँ भन्नै पर्यो होइन अब I get it, you're trying to function as an IR researcher in a particular UK context. त्यहाँको अब हामीले पनि अलिअलि थाहा पाएको REF र अरू रिसर्च एक्सलेन्स के अरे फ्रेमवर्क अन्तर्गतको अडिट सिस्टममा तपाईँ पर्नुहुन्छ. We all know that, हैन? We've been actually hanging out with those people for 30 years now, हैन? तर यस्तो हो के कुरा, if you're not taking Nepal seriously, why bother doing the research भनेर चाहिँ मेरी डेसीले लेखेको कतै एउटा आर्टिकल पढ्नु न तपाईले. If you don't want to take Nepal seriously, you don't have to do this research in Nepal. Okay? You can do this research anywhere you want. But if you want to take Nepal seriously, then you cannot have the excuse, अहिले म अर्ली करियर स्कलर मात्र भएको हुनाले मैले नेपालमा म यसरी मात्र डिल गर्छु भन्न चाहिँ पाइँदैन. त्यो चाहिँ किन भन्न पाइँदैन? हैन त्यो किन भन्न हैन. I mean your written output is suggestive of that. हैन. When you in 25 pages, there are not 5 citations in Nepali. What am I supposed to make? You're not taking the whole corpus of writings by all kinds of ideologues, Maoist and otherwise, Nepali ideologues, seriously on subjects that you are trying to analyze in this book. So if you're not trying to engage with them seriously, then you're not taking Nepal seriously. I mean, that's my conclusion. Right? I mean, you have your own life, you have your own career priorities. I am quite sympathetic to that, right? But you cannot make the excuse saying, oh, early career, oh, this current thing, let me do only this. When I am more secure, I will do another book. You can think of that in your personal capacity, but you cannot actually go around defending poor scholarship by saying that.
But when you by the context, but I was being really honest, the book context right? When say, and your book say, यति बेसी पुग्यो भने मैले अरु किन गर्नु पर्यो भनेर त्यो पनि भनेको छैन हैन. पब्लिश भइसक्यो, अब मेरो नाम चाहिँ छ, मैले किन जान्नु पर्यो नानाथरी भनेर त्यो पनि भनेको छैन. I'm a student हैन, म स्टुडेन्ट नै हो. म तपाईले भनेको कुरा पनि पोजिटिभली एकदम लिन्छु, एन्गेज.
हैन यस्तो भयो कुरा त यस्तो हो नि त. हामी we are now on what I call northern middle age. So I'm a northern middle age man, right? Researcher. I've spent now 30 years after my PhD doing research in Nepal. I expect people who are much younger than me to build on stuff that some of us have written 25, 30 years ago. If you read the editorials of the first 4 issues of Journal Sinas, everything we've discussed in this room, we try to address that on how one should try to write about Nepal. Those editorials were written in 1996, 97, 98. They were not written yesterday. So these are issues that some of us have tried to write about 30 years ago. So you need to actually read what we were trying to do there and then engage with those thoughts.
I'm not arguing with that.
Right? And if you don't do that, you cannot then have the excuse saying, "Mo ta bhakkarko student ho, let me establish myself." Mero kura, you can do that conversation in St. Andrews. If I were in the audience in St. Andrews, I would not be asking any of the questions I have asked today. I would have clapped you and said, yeah. So you are in an audience, primarily Nepali audience, who live in Nepal, who work in Nepal, who do research in Nepal, and for whom this is serious business. Right? As serious as your own stuff in St. Andrews.
Next Martin चौतारीकोमा चाहिँ मैले भरपुर
यो झेली गर्नु पर्यो. We've all made our points decided to go.
हैन यहाँ धेरै चाहिँ एपिस्टोमोलोजी एसोटेरिक ल्याङ्ग्वेज भयो भन्नु
हैन त्यो त हाम्रो सचिनजीले युज गर्नु
होइन त्यो देख्दै त्यस्तो फिल हुन्छ नि. अब त्यो त जुन लेभलको स्कलर हो त्यही लेभलको क्वेशन सोध्नु पर्छ
हैन. First side.
We've had our say. Keshab Giri has had his say. I'd like to thank him for giving us the opportunity to be in this room, have a conversation. May the conversation continue. I appreciate the honesty with which he answered all of our questions. And if people are interested, we should have tea. Thank you. And you should come up.